You are listening to the Norton Library podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, in honor of Jane Austen's 250th birthday, we present a special episode, the Jane Austen Roundtable, featuring three Norton Library editors, Jenny Davidson, Stephanie Insley Hershinow, and Patricia Matthew. We celebrate this special occasion by discussing Austen's legacy, the common themes throughout her work, what makes each work singular, and we also explore Austen's language, her craft as a writer. There's so much to talk about, and we have just the group to do it. Jenny Davidson is professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. She has published 4 books of literary criticism, 4 novels, several other editions, and numerous articles and essays. She is the editor of Austen's Pride and Prejudice for the Norton Library. Stephanie Insley Hershinow is an associate professor of English at Baruch College and the Graduate Center CUNY, where she specializes in novel theory and 18th century culture. She is the author of Born Yesterday, Inexperience, and the Early Realist novel. And for the Norton Library, she has edited Sense and Sensibility and Emma. Patricia Matthew is associate professor of English at Montclair State University. She has been published widely and is the editor of Written Unwritten, Diversity, and the Hidden Truths of Tenure. And she is the co-editor of the Oxford University Press series, Race in 19th Century Literature and Culture. For the Norton Library, she is the editor of Austen's Mansfield Park. Jenny, Stephanie, Patricia, greetings everybody. Welcome to the Jane Austen Roundtable. It's great to have you on the Norton Library podcast for the 250th birthday of Jane Austen. Can I ask how a Jane Austen scholar celebrates the 250th birthday? Jenny Davidson, what's appropriate at this point?
Well, rereading Austen is appropriate at any time, but you asking me this question makes me think I need to find a fancy cake that has a Regency flavor to it so that I can eat it and really get in the mood.
I do like this idea. Maybe we all need to share like a London posset or some kind of like suitably appropriate thing. I mean, I will say it has really been a flood of an anniversary year. There are talks and conferences, a lot of new books coming out. I certainly taught my Austen seminar this year because it felt like the right time to do it.
Can I ask, that might be where a great place to start, Patricia, which is to say, okay, so Jane Austen's turning 250. Why is she still enduring? She seems to be one of the very, very few people with a kind of a permanence. What qualities does Austen and her writing have that have sustained for such a long time?
I think some of it's just the practical matter that there are 6 major novels. So you can read them easily over and over and over again. And so I think people just keep returning to Austen, and she's globally popular. That's what I'm struck by in the 250th year. There are global celebrations, not just in the United States, not just in England. I had an email from a friend in Holland, and emails from people who are in the global South. I mean, just everyone reads her. And I think her heroines, some of them feel really contemporary. And so when you're reading her stories, and I think she's not just read in the Academy, her global fan community, when people read Austen, I think, and I don't say this for every writer, I don't actually think everything is universal, but women and men and non-binary people around the world really see themselves in her stories.
Is there an element that we can pinpoint about what allows her to be so universal and so eternal?
What I'm struck by is the extent to which Austen's fundamental interest is in people and how they behave in small groups. So, people in families, couples, sibling relationships, relationships with people you love, but also with people who you find incredibly annoying. So, it's essentially baked into our brains as human beings. We're like chimpanzees who groom each other every morning and sort of form alliances and so forth. Uh, I I truly can't think of any novelist who has done better than Austen in terms of developing an incredibly precise, engaging, often humorous language for notating the ways that people are responding to each other in a crisis or in a conversation. And I think that's a big part of the appeal.
Stephanie?
Jenny's just absolutely right. I mean, to me, there's this amazing balance of being a psychological and social genius. Like she's so good at capturing someone's thought process after a breakup or something like that. But then also, capturing that kind of social experience. But the thing I wanted to add is she's also just so funny. She's so funny. And I think that's what grabs new readers. I mean, I think some of us with the anniversary year, I don't know, some scholar, I'll speak for myself. I can sometimes roll my eyes like, do we need another do we need another Austen biography? Do we need another Austen graphic novel? But the thing is, there are just waves and waves of new readers constantly. Like I have small kids, but my friends with teenagers are starting to tell me like, oh, they're picking up Austen, or I got them your edition, or, and it's just such a joy to see these people who are new to her go, oh my gosh, this novel from 200 years ago is laugh out loud funny. And it really, really makes a difference, I think, for her longevity.
So when Austen is capturing these minute dynamics of human interaction, and they're set in the early 19th century, there's something about it that's still resonant in the 21st century. So it's of the time, but yet it's for all time. Is that how we're to take Austen, Patricia?
Yeah, I think so. We all have relationships that guide us, that we resist. We all roll our eyes internally at people. There are people in our circle, in our social circle that we feel close to. I think sometimes Austen gives us permission to make fun of people in our head with her very dry, witty narratives about them and her descriptions of them. I think we all have a Fanny Price in our world. I'll just talk about Mansfield Park right away. I think we all have a person who maybe we might think of in some ways as a kind of Debbie Downer, but who we are also very fond of. And so I think that the different kinds of characterizations just haven't faded from society.
Austen is so sharp in her depiction of a framework that even when the particulars that she's writing about are no longer familiar, it's very easy to update them into our own society. So, for instance, when I teach a famous passage in Emma where the awful character Mrs. Elton is speaking loquaciously over an evening, and she keeps on talking about the barouche landau that her family has. Well, barouche landau is a name for a very specific, rather fancy type of carriage that would have been something you could have boasted about in Austen's milieu. But it's really easy to plug it in as if somebody's telling their story, and instead they're saying, and then we got into the Mercedes,
right,
and our Mercedes, so her ear for the ways that we use sort of brand names or boastful things, her ear for the patterns of awful people's speech and the ways that people make themselves ridiculous when they talk. It is just so sharp. You barely need to change the language at all. And this, I think, is why Clueless is, to my mind, the single most brilliant Austen adaptation of all of the last couple decades of movies, because the adapters who made Clueless really see how close you can stay to Austen's story while also being beautifully, modishly contemporary at the same time.
Stephanie, Patricia, do you agree with that blazingly hot take about the adaptation?
No dig to Jenny, but it's not even a hot take. This is just established wisdom. I think Austin World of Clueless is just an incredibly deft adaptation. And the thing about Clueless that always gets me is there actually are some real liberties that it takes, not with the transposition of time and place, but the fact that that Cher, the Emma figure, has a best friend in Dion, which Emma doesn't have in the novel. You know, it feels like a very big change, but it works so well. I think Amy Heckerling is just so sharp and such a good reader of Austen that I just fully agree. Yeah, it works beautifully and it teaches beautifully, and it's also just such good fun.
Are there other adaptations that you think are essential entries into going back into the novel, Jenny Davidson?
I'd love to hear Tricia talk about Patricia Rozima's Mansfield Park adaptation.
So I'm teaching my Austen seminar this semester as a graduate seminar, and get to Rozima in a moment. But what's fascinating is I would say roughly half the students, we've just finished Pride and Prejudice, and roughly half the students only knew the Joe Wright adaptation. And some of the students had watched every Pride and Prejudice adaptation and hadn't read the novel. And so what's fascinating to me is for them to understand how much sharper Austen is in the novel, particularly the relationships between sisters and the relationships between Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet and Elizabeth. I think Rozima's Mansfield Park, which is the biggest challenge in working on the Mansfield Park edition for Norton, is that she completely turns that novel inside out, and she takes what might have seemed like a leitmotif and makes it the dominant tone of the entire adaptation. In working on the introduction for Mansfield Park, I find myself balancing understanding and loving that adaptation. I think it's rich and it's powerful. I think it brings all of Austen in. I think it works with the juvenilia in really wonderful ways. And I think it makes Fanny Price more interesting thematically than she would be otherwise. But the tone in the novel is different. The novel is more comic than the film is. And I think the sex appeal of the Crawfords works in terms of working. It sort of feels like I'm watching what Austen would do. But I think that what Rozima does is just open up questions across all of the novels. I think there's a sense that we think of Mansfield Park as the novel in which Austen does politics. The truth of the matter is there are politics that course through all of the novels. And we want to cordon off some of them and say, oh, this is not what Pride and Prejudice is about. This is not what Northanger Abbey is about. And on a plot level, that's absolutely true. But it's the same Austen, or the same version, or the same kind of Austen that wrote all of them. This is the same novelist. The fact that she sort of turns her attention to something that feels in our time, in the 20th century, 21st century, really potent and necessary to think about. It's actually there, I think, across all of the novels.
Patricia, that's a point that I really wanted to touch on. You mentioned in your first answer, you said, well, there are 6 major novels. So all of the novels are major, and are they all of a kind? Is there like a Jane Austen novel where you're expecting a set quantity of elements? How much variation is there among the 6?
I just think the generic conventions of the novel sort of are present across all 6. I think that in Northanger Abbey, she's much more aware of the fact that she's writing a novel. In fact, she has that very famous defense of the novel early on. But over the course of the novels, I think that we come to understand that I don't want to say that there are stereotypes necessarily, but we understand that the frictions that are going to be there, that these are novels where young people often, not always, but often have to understand a set of lessons and understand themselves as part of a larger moral culture. And we see that transition over the course of the novel. I paused there for a second because I think the women shift and change over the novel. not all of the heroes. I think that Knightley is the same at the beginning as he is at the end, and that it's Elizabeth that changes. I'll be curious to see what Jenny and Stephanie think about that. But I do think that these are novels where women come to understand themselves in a really particular context about their responsibilities to society, to the larger culture, and to themselves and what they want in their hearts. And I think that happens repeatedly over the course of the novels.
Yeah. Jenny Davidson.
I have two different points I'd like to make. First of all, I'd just like to say I love Tricia's account of the ways in which the novels are similar to each other, or a body of novels that are governed by the same rules. But certainly many readers have felt more aware of the differences between the novels than the similarities, which is to say, Northanger Abbey, published posthumously, but the earliest chronologically in terms of composition of Austen's major fictions. It's shorter. It's much more explicitly satirical. The pacing is quite different than Austen's other novels. And there's not quite as much opportunity to think of the characters as fully rounded, as opposed to sort of tools of a satirical purpose. Mansfield Park is often thought of as an outlier because the heroine is so different from Austen's other heroines. And then again, Persuasion has a sort of sadder tonal register in many ways than any of the other novels, or goes into more emotional depth and complexity than any of the other novels, except perhaps Mansfield Park. So there's certainly, you can make the case either way. They're all formed to a pattern. There's overriding similarity, but there are also some very real differences when we look at them individually. So that was my first point. The second thing that I wanted to say is that I think that most readers of Austen would agree that it's fair to describe these books as novels about courtships. That's the template that Austen is working with in all of these fictions. But readers who haven't picked up an Austen novel yet, because they think they're not interested in fictions about courtship, are really missing out. Because what the courtship plot does for Austen, or for other novelists of her own time, slightly earlier novelist Frances Burney would be another good example. The novel of courtship that's just the template that you have for thinking about the kinds of complex moral and political decision-making that you need to engage in as you move from somebody who is not yet fully launched into some kind of adult life versus somebody who then is in a stable doing. So to pick up on one of the other questions that you asked us about, I don't have a favorite Austen novel, but I have had a favorite Austen novel for each stage of life, where I feel that in each stage of life I've been in, there has been an Austen novel that seemed the one that resonated with the self I was at that point. So as a child, the simplicity of Pride and Prejudice, the appeal of the slightly rebellious, intellectually quick, charming Elizabeth Bennet. That was obviously my favorite of all of the novels. As a graduate student, I felt that Mansfield Park was really by far the most psychologically compelling, because Fanny Price is a sort of hanger-on and dependent in the Bertram family, in the same ways that when you're a graduate student at many universities, you feel like the sort of the neglected stepchild rather than one of the real members of the family. And then as an assistant professor, Sense and Sensibility really spoke to me, because Eleanor Dashwood, the protagonist of that novel, has essentially been brought up to put other people's needs before her own, and to assume a stoical affect even when she's very upset about things. And that felt exactly what life as an untenured professor in modern academia felt like, especially if you were female. I'd love to hear. Yeah. I'd love to hear from the others. They're thinking about a favorite Austen novel, or my theory that there is an Austen novel for every stage of life.
Stephanie, what do you think?
I love that so much, Jenny. And I have to say, I wish I could say the same, but I have been an Emma girl from the very beginning, and I will continue to be an Emma girl. Probably, I mean, who can predict? But I don't see it changing anytime soon. And I say that proudly because there are a lot of Emma detractors out there. Some really perceptive readers hate Emma. And so one of the things I talk about in my introduction is what it means to hate Emma. And Austen herself kind of anticipated this reaction, and some of her earliest readers, her family and friends, from whom she solicited her own little kind of like social Goodreads. A lot of them were like, "What is this novel?" I think one thing I love about it um, picks up on what you, Trisha and Jenny, have both said, which is that to me, it really highlights the way that she is, in my mind, an experimental novelist. I know we use that term usually to talk about, the avant-garde, but to me, what that means is she has these constraints, what Jenny called a template, what Trisha's been calling this kind of basic frame of her novels. And within that set of constraints, she's really pushing herself to see what she can do, what kinds of variables she can change, and what the consequences might be. And so for me, Emma is so fascinating because she changes a very significant variable, which is that she has this woman who doesn't actually need to get married, right? Every Austen heroine needs to get married to some extent, but Emma doesn't have the same kinds of inducements to marriage that all of the other heroines have. And so in some sense, her courtship plot is kind of gratuitous. And to me, like trying to figure out what that would look like in a novel makes it just, I don't, fireworks. It's so fascinating to me how she's trying to kind of work that out over the course of that novel.
If Austen is presenting that a woman is going to marry the richest person that she can stand, is she bemoaning that fact of life? Is she celebrating it, documenting it? Or does it change from scenario to scenario? Jenny?
Austen left behind letters that were fairly extensively censored by her sister Cassandra after she died. We suspect to take out, satirical commentary about sisters-in-law and brothers, other personal remarks that might have hurt people's feelings, and who knows what else we're missing. And compared to many writers' letters, compared, for instance, to the letters of John Keats, which are relatively contemporary and which are full of explicit theorizing about art and poetry and composition. Austen didn't leave letters like that. But they still have some value in terms of giving us something to cross-check what we see as the arguments of the novels. So we have a really interesting sequence of letters where Austen is giving advice to a niece of hers about whether she should marry a man who's a good prospect, who's financially well off, and who everybody would regard as a good husband for her, but who she isn't in love with. And Austen states explicitly there, if you are not in love with him, you shouldn't even be thinking about this. Not in quite so many words, but that's the gist of it. So we have evidence from Austen's life that she felt very strongly, and there may have been an element of her Christianity speaking to this too, that there would be a kind of degradation involved in marrying for anything other than love, than true partnership, of which love is one part. There's a clear sense that she condemns that. But Pride and Prejudice is the novel where she treats this most explicitly, because Elizabeth Bennet, who is poor but is very attractive and personable, has the luxury of saying, I'd rather die than have to marry somebody I didn't love. But her friend Charlotte Lucas, who's a little bit older and considerably less pretty and less charming in her personality, it is Austen shows us in the person of Charlotte Lucas why in the real world, why in something like the real world, if you were a vulnerable young woman with no assets to your name and no big prospects in your own right, marriage to a man who was financially secure was quite literally the only way of not falling into poverty once perhaps the father had died and the fortune went elsewhere, or there wasn't much of a fortune and so forth. So Austen Austen jokes about the idea of, it being the essential thing to marry for as much money as possible. But in reality, she's aware both of the financial pressures that make that sadly necessary for women, and of the ways in which to marry without there being any chance of love in the picture is a form of self-abuse or of self-degradation.
So I'm hearing that you're reading social, political, and gender commentary into these novels that Austen is writing as she's dramatizing this dynamic. Patricia, please.
Yeah, and just to pick up on what Jenny was talking about, in terms of the vulnerabilities of the women in the novels, vulnerability that doesn't always go away. So Mrs. Bennet is so anxious about the entail. She's anxious about what might happen. Sense and Sensibility begins with the problem of an inheritance and the father not setting things up well for his children, his daughters. I always think of, and Sense and Sensibility, by the way, is my novel. I will read Sense and Sensibility till the end of time. I'm not sure. Someone once compared me to Emma, and I've never gotten over it. Maybe that's part of the problem. But I'm really fascinated both by the heroines in Sense and Sensibility and the fact that the heroes themselves are not always inspiring. But I think that here in Sense and Sensibility in particular, Austen echoes Mary Wollstonecraft, who talks about the dangers of women not being ready and prepared to care for themselves, because then they would be dependent. And Charlotte Lucas says this to Elizabeth when she explains why she's marrying Mr. Collins. She doesn't want to be a burden on her family. She doesn't want to be a burden on her brother. And she also understands the social necessity of a woman in that world, from that class in particular, having her own home. She's setting herself up as to stay in the community. If you have a home, you can have a house guest. If you can have a house guest, you can introduce young women to other possible eligible young men. In fact, in Pride and Prejudice, it's when Elizabeth is visiting Charlotte Lucas that she gets to understand men, I think, in a different way. And so there's this idea of marriage, not just about love. I always think of Marianne teasing Eleanor, saying, "You esteem Edward." But marriage is your responsibility to keep the social fabric together, so that the family, and this is, I always wonder why Margaret, my students and I always like, what is Margaret doing in Sense and Sensibility? And I think she's a promise of the future. And also she's vulnerable to her older sister's responsibilities and their reactions and how they behave in the world, because she's going to be the next generation of Dashwood girls who has to find a husband. And so marriage then, and the idea of marriage is, I think that Jenny's absolutely right. You want to, it's companionate marriage. You want to marry someone that you want to spend time with. And in each of the novels, maybe not in each, I think in each of the novels, we see a marriage that isn't a happy one. We actually see unhappy marriages between people who have outgrown their initial attraction, but are still stuck in this institution.
Again, in terms of Austen's own biography, she was the daughter of a clergyman in the Church of England. So the family home in which she grew up was contingent upon him holding that position in the church. And when he retired from that position and the position passed instead to one of his sons, that was extraordinarily painful for Jane Austen and her sister Cassandra, because that meant their dispossession from what had been the family home, from really living there to being only visitors. And when we read the surviving letters, especially between Austen and her sister, they bounced around from one brother's household to another. Not all of the sisters-in-law were kind or generous people at all. And there was always a sense of being dependent on the charity or largesse of a of a male sibling and his wife, who often would be the person who sort of set the tone for the hospitality of the house. And we see that thematized in almost every one of the novels, that this painful vulnerability that comes when a brother who's been in some sense a loved older sibling or younger sibling, but who marries somebody who brings out their mercenary side and their selfishness. The opening of Sense and Sensibility is the most brilliant vision of this, I think, in all of Austen, where we see how Eleanor and Marianne's brother, John Dashwood, has married a woman who is cold, ambitious, highly mercenary, and their brother himself is a very weak man. He has vaguely good intentions, but he himself is also quite selfish and would rather use his resources to support his children than his sisters. And we see over that chapter, we get this amazing depiction of the sort of psychology of how one spouse can talk the other spouse out of their generous intentions into something much more meager and miserly. So the vulnerability of adult single women in this social class to the generosity of their male siblings and their male siblings' household, it's a very, very painful fact of life in the novels and in this period.
That's a great point. I wanted to pick up a little bit on the psychology that you're referring to, Stephanie, in your introduction to Emma in the Norton Library edition. You talk a little bit about Austen's focus on the trivial, a minute moment that she turns into a brilliant investigation into human psychology. And I wonder if we could all talk about that, if you could all share maybe a moment in Austen that reveals this genius of Austen to take a seemingly insignificant moment or minor moment, but it actually, because of her perception, it becomes riveting and dramatic. Stephanie, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is just so key to her art. And I think, there are Austen detractors out there who say, like, well, nothing even happens, or, they're just these small communities that, they're not these kind of big world historical, kinds of novels. And she said this kind of thing herself. Like, she had nieces and nephews who were aspiring writers when she started to publish, and she gives advice to a niece where she even recommends to her, this is a famous line now, but 3 or 4 families in a country village. It's the perfect thing to work on, right? And that's what we see in a novel like Emma, where Emma herself, as much as she is sometimes derided for being a snob and being kind of full of herself, she's barely left that town. She's never been to visit her sister in London. She's never been to the seaside. She's certainly never left England. And so her whole world is this village. I think Austen is constantly thinking about how much can happen in a small space, how much can happen in a parlor. The moment that comes to mind to me is this beautiful moment, this kind of rare moment toward the end of Emma in chapter 5 of volume 3, where we're focalized actually through Knightley, through the male lead, rather than through Emma. And we see Knightley just in an evening kind of social gathering. He's watching a game being played. And I won't get too far into the significance, but he sees this very fleeting moment where 2 other characters, Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, are playing a game together. And for almost a split second, he notices that Frank's done something that really upsets Jane. Probably no one else in the room can see it, but he sees this, and for him, everything snaps into place, right? This small interaction, and Emma is a novel that is constantly thinking about game playing on a number of different levels. But just the way she zeroes in on his perception, on the kinds of the little moments that can happen in plain sight, but that can have like all of this kind of hidden depth and meaning. She does it all over the place, but that's one of those where, like, mind blown, works for me every time.
Jenny, do you have a moment?
I have a short one. I mean, you've asked a question by asking us about these telling details. You've asked a question that we could now spend about 8 hours sitting in a room, like sharing. Oh yeah, and this one. Oh yeah, that's my favorite too. But the first one that came to mind when you asked that, it's just there's so many like this. It's hard to choose. When Elizabeth Bennet comes back to her hometown after having been traveling, her younger sisters, her madcap younger sisters, meet her, and Lydia, who is the uncontrollable, exuberant daughter in the novel, has this sort of her monologue is notated by Austen. Like it's given as these are the things Lydia is saying, and everything she says is just she's oblivious to how funny it is. So if I paraphrase, from the top of my head, she says, "Oh, and now we're going to treat you two older sisters to a lovely meal at the inn. Don't you love it? Oh, and you're going to have to pay because we spent all of our money already." She says, "And look at these hats that we spent our money on. They're sort of ugly, but once I do a little bit to it, it will be beautiful." And so this heedlessness, it's Austen doesn't have to explain it. She just shows it by the characters show themselves in their own words, and the very distinctive sort of cast of thought and the way that the train of thought of an individual character works are just they're sketched so beautifully and economically in Austen's pages. Trisha, what do you think?
I think for me, it's John Willoughby explaining to Eleanor why he doesn't choose Marianne. And I think it's such a beautiful speech. He begins, "I had always been expensive." And just that phrasing that sort of lets readers understand the world that Willoughby is born into, that his path is set for him in some ways. He has agency, he has choice. But the fact that he makes the speech and the fact that he gets to tell it to Eleanor, right? She's sort of the wisest person in the novel, the moral center in so many ways, and that and Austen so beautifully, we actually just know that Eleanor is there and listening and responding, not because the narrator comes in and tells us explicitly that this is there, but the description of her nod, the way that she leans forward, and then this idea that Eleanor somehow forgives Willoughby, or understands at least that his decision was not particular. I mean, it was reckless, but so was Marianne. I don't like Marianne Dashwood. That's fine. But that Willoughby was actually on a path. And the fact that the narrator goes to great lengths at the end of the novel to tell us that he's fine. Right? He's not habitually in a gloom because he doesn't get to marry Marianne. He likes his wife. His dogs are nice. He likes his horses. He has a really good life. I think in that moment we get the beginning of the end of his narrative arc that's actually more generous to him than maybe we would want to be at the beginning of the novel, because she reveals this inner thing. I just love that line. I had always, the grammar of it is fascinating to me. I had always been expensive.
I have to pick up on this because I also love that scene so much. And it's so heartbreaking to me. If you read Emma Thompson's diaries when she was writing the screenplay to the Ang Lee Sense and Sensibility adaptation, she writes about how she had to cut that scene because if she had Willoughby confessing to Eleanor at the end, the viewer wouldn't actually accept Marianne being with Brandon. And she really needed the viewer to be behind that. And so she cut that big confession scene from Willoughby. But it is one of my favorites in all of Austen's novels. And I have to just add this talk about a trivial moment, this fleeting moment at the very end of that when Eleanor she turns to go to bed after Willoughby's leaving. And she thinks to herself for a split second, well, maybe his wife will die. His wife will die, and Marianne. And it is in some way very out of character for Eleanor to think something like that, but it's also very in character that she just has this gush of compassion for the two of them, and it's just one of these like, well, what if moments that I think Austen also can mobilize just so beautifully. And I relate to it so much, just having that thought that you're not supposed to think It's just perfect.
Something I'm really loving as I listen to the two of you talk about your favorite scenes in Austen is I think our conversation is really demonstrating how incredibly vivid and clear and memorable Austen's stories and scenes are. So as to say, uh, the reason that the novels invite this reading and rereading and rereading, I say in my introduction to Pride and Prejudice, I'm sure I've read it more than 50 times. How crazy is that? I've probably read Pride and Prejudice 60 times in my life. None of the others quite as many as that, but it's certainly in the 20s or 30s. Is that these scenes and these characters, they're almost more vivid and real to us as our own close friends and family members, because Austen sees and observes with such clarity and precision. Uh, we can't forget these moments; they're imprinted in us.
Yeah, maybe to go back to your earlier question about Austen's longevity, Jenny so beautifully sort of, this is the Austen of my youth, this is the Austen of my early career. When you go back and reread Austen, you're so rewarded because a moment is coming that you anticipate and you recognize it, and you understand sort of the rhythm of this narrative, and when you get there. But also, I think that we read Austen differently as we age. I think that the young me who read Pride and Prejudice was very much attached to Elizabeth. As I got older, Charlotte became more sympathetic to me. In my most recent rereading for a different project, I found myself feeling real sympathy for Mrs. Bennet. She is depicted, particularly in film adaptations, though I think Joe Wright gets the exhaustion that she faces and what it means to have 5 daughters, but that she needs to, that she has to find husbands for. And she keeps tittering on about her nerves. And the truth of the matter is she's married to an irresponsible man who's not sympathetic to her needs, who openly is disdainful of her, and who likes his daughters, particularly Elizabeth, more than he likes his wife. And she knows. And when you're young, I from this very room in which I'm sitting, I read Pride and Prejudice for the first time. Right. So I didn't pay attention to Mrs. Bennet. I was probably 18 or 19 myself. But as I've gotten older, I thought, oh, the challenge is really huge for her, and her attachment to Lydia, and understanding that, by the time she has Lydia, there are not going to be any sons. And now what we understand about what it would mean to keep getting pregnant and keep giving birth, and the dangers of pregnancy, and the terror, and understanding every time a child is born and it's not a son, that would have been a responsibility that she would have taken on herself. I'm much more sympathetic to her. Never to Wickham.
Just to add to that, I was a precocious reader. I was probably 8 or 9 when I first read Pride and Prejudice, and I really think I understood almost all of it very well. But I would say there were 2 things that I didn't understand. One of them is something quite different from what you are talking about. That's the extent to which the character of Mary, the dull, pretentious, pseudo-academic sister, is a topical intervention in an active debate among novelists in the 1790s about what women should be like, and in particular the pretensions of a certain kind of blue stocking woman. Otherwise it's just mean. You need that context to really understand why Mary is ridiculous in the way she is. But the big thing that I think I just genuinely missed, and again it has to do with the way that when you're a young daughter with perhaps a much loved father who is not always as responsible or as kind to his wife as he should be, like you see the good parts of Mr. Bennet that Elizabeth sees at the beginning of the novel, and it's very, very hard to really face the extent to which Pride and Prejudice, the novel, is incredibly critical, explicitly critical of Mr. Bennet. And by the end of the novel, we're left in no doubt he is the person who is culpable for this situation. It's his weakness and procrastination. And Elizabeth now understands, for instance, his delays in letter writing when there's this, terrible family calamity. It's not just the sort of charming absent-mindedness of, of somebody who's wonderful. It's it's a real culpable failure to fill even the basic expectations of responsibility that he's the only person who can have. So that was hard for me as I became an adult reader to let myself really understand what it is that Austen is saying about Mr. Bennet.
You three have been talking about Austen's psychological acuity, how she dramatizes minute situations, how she's commenting about things of her era. But Patricia's point about the grammar in that one particular sentence makes me think that maybe we're talking around Austen as a writer, as a stylist, and maybe for people who aren't specialists, haven't read Austen before, you say, well, she wrote more than 200 years ago. Is it dry? Is it maybe I wouldn't be able to connect with the language of that time? Can we just end by talking about Austen, the writer?
I'm so glad you asked this question, Mark, because there's a way that the Austen kind of industry, the whole, Austeniana, the kind of celebrations that we have around her life, especially in an anniversary year like this, can get really caught up in the beauty and the fun and of the material culture, of the balls, of all the kind of trappings, the Regency trappings of her novels, and I love that stuff too. But I also love her sentences. I mean, she is also, widely recognized to be one of the greatest prose stylists in English, one of the master novelists in any language. And so I'm really glad you asked us about that. I think anybody who is familiar, with the movies, who loves Austen because of those stories that they've gotten through adaptation, should really come and please read them. Read them. Like there's so many gems in there that you're missing, just because of the kinds of economy that a screenplay requires. She's known, just among other things, I'll just mention one kind of hallmark of her writing, which is this narrative technique called free and direct discourse, which is this very complex kind of narrative move where what we see is this, it's always almost difficult to describe this kind of blending of the narrator's voice and the character's voice. We see it all over the place in Emma and Sense and Sensibility, where it seems as if the narrator is kind of dipping into the consciousness of those characters. And it produces all of these kind of masterful effects, one of which is that I think this is one of the things that produces the kind of intimacy that we feel with these characters, because it really does feel like we are able to access private thoughts, right? The kinds of thinking that you're never going to share with anybody else. And so when Eleanor Dashwood learns that her situationship, the guy that she really likes, she learns that he's engaged, at the end of volume 1. This isn't even a spoiler. It happens very early in the novel. And almost immediately we move into free and direct discourse, where the narrator is kind of telling us that she's thinking to herself, but almost immediately starts taking on Eleanor's kind of patterns of speech. It's so subtle, but it is really masterful. Austen didn't invent this technique. We can find it in earlier writing, but she's widely recognized to be a master of doing this. And there is, it can do so many different things in the novel, but I do think one of the things that it does is it really draws us in, and it really makes us commit to these characters.
Mm-hmm. Patricia, what strikes you about Austen's style?
So I said earlier, because I'm really interested in genre and the fact that we're in a courtship novel, and that Austen knows that we're in a courtship novel, and that there are certain things that she needs to do as a writer of a courtship novel. And I love those moments when she sort of steps out of that role in the narrator's voice. And so if you will let me just read just this brief moment from Mansfield Park, the final chapter. She writes, "Let other pens dwell on guilt and misery. I quit such odious subjects as soon as I can, impatient to restore everybody, not greatly in fault themselves, to tolerable comfort, and to have done with all the rest." And this idea that she reminds us that this is a story, I'm telling you the story, I understand that I have to tell the story, and now that I've reached the end, I need to wrap these things up. And then she says, and closer to the end of the novel, that's the final chapter. She writes, I purposefully abstain from dates on this occasion, that everyone may be at liberty to fix their own, aware that the cure of unconquerable passions and the transfer of unchanging attachments must vary much as time to time in different people. I only entreat everybody to believe that exactly at the time when it was quite natural that it should be so, and not a week earlier, Edmund did cease to care about Miss Crawford and became as anxious to marry Fanny as Fanny herself could desire. I just think that self-conscious understanding that there's a job that the writer has to do to the narrator, and then inviting the reader in, you're in on it, right? She says, listen, we have to do this work, and I'm going to leave it to you because we all have a different understanding and expectation about how long one should go before falling out of love with one person and declaring ourselves in love with another person. And I think that's part of the genius of her writing.
I love that so much, Trisha. And I think one of the things that you're drawing out, and I'll just really just kind of repeat it, is that so much of what you get when you really start to get to know Austen in the way that we do, is just what a masterful reader she is and how that gets reflected in her writing. And so she's someone who was a voracious reader. Her father had a pretty significant library and he let her just roam through it. And this was not, super typical, especially for a young woman in the late 18th century. But we know that she read so widely, and she's really kind of talking back to this kind of emergent novelistic tradition that she's read so widely in. And so I love all of those little winking moments. And so many of them are precisely, as Tricia says, they're about invoking these conventions that her readers would have known, or, invoking these kinds of genres and like participating in these little kind of knowing. It's almost like it makes me think of Bugs Bunny, like there's a real kind of like
breaking the wall and
right, the metalepsis where she's kind of winking at the camera, like that kind of effect. And but it's not just her humor, though it is her humor. It is also just the way she's participating in this tradition of writing that she knows she's becoming a part of. Whether or not she thought she would be read in 250 years, probably not. But she is still like making all of these moves to kind of join the ranks of these other writers that she admired and that she sometimes kind of affectionately parodies, but she's kind of putting her novels in line with them.
Earlier in this discussion, our three Austen scholars, are you called Austeneers, Austenettes? What's the proper term?
It's tricky because the big term for Austen fan is Janeite, but Janeite and Austen scholar are not always overlapping terms. And so I don't know that I fully count as a Janeite among Janeites, but I am an Austen lover and fan.
Okay. I wanted to get the term right. Well, you were suggesting what is her masterpiece, or if she even has one. I guess the question I want to leave our Norton Library listeners with is, where should they start? Let's say we haven't read an Austen novel yet. They're all major novels. They're all masterpieces. We know the chronology of it, but is that the same as the first one we should pick up? Patricia, what do you think?
So I wrestled with this a little bit because, as Jenny points out, Northanger Abbey is published posthumously, but it makes sense, I think, to start with Northanger Abbey.
Interesting.
Actually, I would even go further back, and I would start with the Juvenilia. I think that it's delightful and probing and risky and risque. I think its publishing history is fascinating. If I could,
It'll whet your appetite.
Yes.
For the rest.
And then you sort of see what happens, sort of moving. So I think starting with Northanger Abbey makes a great deal of sense. It's also, I think, if you haven't read Austen, or if you haven't read 19th century novels, it's a good thing to start with a shorter novel. I think it's hilarious. The fact that it plays with Gothic traditions and the genre of the Gothic also introduces you to, I think, Austen's readers and the world that she's writing into. So I think starting with Northanger Abbey makes a lot of sense.
Stephanie, what do you think?
Oh, those are great suggestions. And I'd say, especially if anyone is interested in her juvenilia, her teenage writings, pick up Lady Susan, which is just one example. Her teenage writings are many. She fills 3 full volumes of writings from the time she's around 12 to around 17 or 18. But Lady Susan is just such a gem. It's about this really lusty widow who is just sleeping with everybody in town and kind of scheming against even her own daughter. But I'll add to Trisha's great recommendation. If you are an Austen fan because of Joe Wright, an Austen fan because of Emma Thompson, because of Clueless, and you haven't read Pride and Prejudice, sit your butt down and read Pride and Prejudice, please, because I do think, as has been mentioned over the course of the conversation, there are some delights to be had in there that don't make their way into the film, and you're only going to find more to love. But it's a great entryway for someone who already feels like they know everything, you know what I mean? To actually dive in to the prose and get some familiarity with the writing and to find all the joy that comes with that part.
We have been talking with Jenny Davidson, Patricia Matthew, and Stephanie Insley Hershinow to celebrate Jane Austen's 250th birthday. It's been an honor. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Happy birthday, Jane.
Happy birthday, Jane. Thank you so much.
The Norton Library editions of Jane Austen's work, Emma and Sense and Sensibility, edited by Stephanie Insley Hershinow, and Pride and Prejudice, edited by Jenny Davidson, are available now in paperback and ebook. Mansfield Park, edited by Patricia Matthew, will be available in spring 2026. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.